Egypt, as we've pointed out on this program before, ever since the removal of the last elected government, has been run by an iron dictatorship. The repression in Egypt, according to many observers, is now worse than it was even under Hosni Mubarak, the dictator who the Egyptian masses removed after a long struggle. And yet this dictatorship is, unsurprisingly, supported by the West. Field Marshal Sisi, as he calls himself, is favorite in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, warmly welcomed by Washington, supported by the current government in Great Britain and the French, and of course a number of former British government ministers, including a former prime minister, are working for him, taking a lot of money from the Egyptian exchequer to supposedly rebrand the country as something that is acceptable. Fortunately for us, a book has just been published which demolishes all the claims that are being made for Sisi and takes us back into Egyptian history. The book is called The Egyptians, a Radical Story by Jack Schenker, and it's a book which has a few special qualities not seen that often these days in publishing. Jack, welcome to the World Today.
Thank you for inviting me on.
What struck me particularly, amongst many other things in your book, is the speed with which Nasser's reforms in the countryside were dismantled. I mean, I remember it now. Your book recalled it very wonderfully for me. But the Sadat era, the succession to Nasser after he died, and you remind us that when that guy died, 5 million people came out onto the streets and wept, which has not happened to any Egyptian leader before or since, which indicates his popularity with the people. But he was replaced by another guy, an army free officer who'd participated in the movement, but he went in totally the other direction. Even before the Soviet Union had collapsed, he decided to sell his soul effectively to the United States. And the speed was very fast with which they did. How did that happen, and was there a resistance?
Absolutely. Well, what's interesting is that Anwar Sadat took power at such an interesting moment in a global context in which neoliberal ideas, suffused with the language of modernity, of common sense, many of these catchphrases which have become so familiar to us today when talking about the prevailing economic orthodoxy, it came at a time in which that was beginning to dominate kind of international discussion. As you say, it was before the Soviet Union collapsed, but it came after a period in which, as you know very well, think tanks and key economic institutions and of course kind of political leaders, not just in the global north but in the global south, were beginning to implement that orthodoxy. So Anwar Sadat had this opportunity to present himself as the figurehead of an economically liberalizing movement. But what was critical was he was able to use the repressive institutions of the state, which had been designed by Gamal Abdel Nasser to insulate Egypt's political and military elite from mass democratic politics. Now, under Gamal Abdel Nasser, it was part of a social contract in which...
Paternalistic.
Very paternalistic, and very much about infantilizing essentially large sections of the population and saying, look, there is a patriarchal relationship here. We, as the political leaders and as the military leaders, will look after you, we will ensure full employment, we will provide subsidised health and education, we will raise your living standards, and in return, you will remain off the political stage. Now, as long as those social gains were still being provided by the government, by and large, people respected Gamal Abdel Nasser. That doesn't mean that they were in any way passive. That social contract was constantly contested and reshaped. It was a dynamic process. And what economic liberalisation in Egypt, known as the Infatah, the opening, achieved was that the social contract was corroded. And by the time you get to Hosni Mubarak's era, where really intense neoliberal reforms are being played out, and many of the old social assets are being privatised and shepherded into the hands of speculators. You have Egyptian workers saying, well, hold on a second, we were told by Gamal Abdel Nasser and every leader since that we were in some kind of partnership with the state against the feudalists and imperialists. And yet now I find myself being employed supposedly by a Spanish speculator who's put me on a temporary contract, who is laying off staff, working in QIZs, zones which are designed to work in partnership with the Israeli state to produce goods for export. What part of this social contract still applies? Just in answer to your question about whether there was resistance in the 1970s, well, yes, there was. I mean, and once again, our old friends, the World Bank and the IMF played a role here. In 1977,
they stopped subsidies.
Absolutely, and not for the first time. An attempt by the Egyptian government to withdraw subsidies provoked huge unrest on the streets. Sadat called it an uprising of thieves. The democratic president, as Sadat styled himself, wants the people to bow low. It sounds better in Arabic than it does in English, but really dismantling his entire justification for rule. And that experience of contesting the state, of fighting with the security forces, of challenging the state narratives, lay down the roots for what would transpire several decades later in 2011 when the Egyptian revolution began.
Because, when I traveled around Egypt a number of times, what you feel is a very strong historical memory.
Absolutely, yes. And that has been key to the revolution from day one.
They remember every small episode, small battles won, big battles lost, why they were lost, the feeling of elation when they won them, even on the level of the village.
Yes,
it's very strong, isn't it?
Well, I talk in the book about Mubarak's land reform program in the late 1990s and throughout the 2000s, which was pushed through by USAID and also the IMF and the World Bank under Egypt's structural adjustment program, where farmers who had worked tenant plots for decades and generations were told, well, suddenly this land has been marketised, you either stump up the market rent or you get out or you go to the debtor's prison. There were thousands of villages that placed black flags at the entrances on the roadside as a testament to, we are rejecting this policy, we are rejecting this assault on our livelihood and on the social goods that we hold in common. And when you go to those villages today and other towns and communities that have played host to incredible battles with Egypt's security forces, who, let's not forget, are funded by the US. Egypt receives more military aid than any other country in the world apart from Israel, is armed by several Western countries, including Britain. They talk to you about the history of these struggles. And what's so interesting now is that as President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi and his Western allies attempt to rewrite the history of the national revolution with mixed success, at times the counter-revolution has unfortunately managed to gain some popular support, although it's very tenuous support. They haven't been able to destroy the historical memory of all those smaller battles that occurred both before the revolution started and since Mubarak was toppled. And that lineage and that memory of resistance really lives on.
And Jack, what is usually ignored in the West is that when Sadat came to power, he used the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist groups, sent them into the universities to destroy the secular nationalist left, the Nasserites, backed by the state and the repressive agencies. And then people wonder, how is it that Islamist groups became so strong? They were backed in Egypt, as in Pakistan, by the state from the top, with the total backing of Washington.
Absolutely.
That's what they did. And so it's ironic that having created and built up these groups to help fight in Afghanistan and other places, Sadat was ultimately knocked off in the most dramatic fashion, taking a salute at a military parade, and his own soldiers come up and shoot him dead. And Mubarak survived because, you know, the archive of that event is very strong in my memory. Mubarak is on the floor, hiding under a table, so that he can do business another day, which he did.
Well, the relationship between the steel heart of the old state and the deep state, i.e. the military, and the Islamists has always been symbiotic, exactly as you say. And in many ways, the two have always relied on one another. Mubarak did fight what the state described as a sort of as essentially a counterinsurgency operation in Upper Egypt against Islamist terrorists. But Mubarak also promoted and allowed the Muslim Brotherhood to run as independents in the elections, and in the mid-2000s, in the parliamentary elections, most of which, of course, were largely fixed, and this was not a genuine democratic process, but he allowed the Islamists to gain a large number of seats precisely so that he could turn around to his Western allies and say, you see what happens when you don't have a strong man like me at the helm. The Islamists will run ragged, Egypt as a strategic ally will become compromised, and this is why you have to put all your chips on me. And Abdel Fattah al-Sisi is continuing this now, just as he prosecutes his so-called war on terrorism, which in reality, in a large part, is a war on anybody who dares to display any political opposition or dares to speak with an autonomous voice. He also relies hugely on the regional context of the so-called Islamic State, ISIS, and general state fragmentation in countries like Libya and Syria and Iraq, both for a domestic audience and an international audience. His message to Western leaders, including Prime Minister David Cameron, is, I am the man who, A, will carry on liberalising the economy and implement neoliberal orthodoxy, and B, I will hold back the forces of jihadism.
And then coming to the first free election, you have a situation where the Brotherhood, because it's the only organised political force which has been, to a certain extent, in opposition, they win the election. Now, the army could have collaborated with them had they so wished, because Morsi wasn't threatening to anyone. He'd told the Americans he was prepared to do what they want. He told the Israelis, we'll be tougher on the Palestinians than even Mubarak was. Began to put sewage in the tunnels that went into Gaza from the Egyptian side, behaved in a miserable way, sent messages to the secret police and the secret state, we can work with you just like you worked with Mubarak. There's no reason to panic, etc., etc., etc. So they completely betrayed everything that that movement had stood for. You know, some form of liberty, some form of equality. They betrayed it. And so it became relatively easy for Sisi, though, you know, regrettably so, to mobilize liberals and others to get rid of them.
Absolutely. Well, the Muslim Brotherhood has never been a revolutionary organisation, at least in its modern incarnation. At best, it's a reformist movement, but it also replicated the strict hierarchies of the state. You know, there's very much a culture within the Muslim Brotherhood of unquestioning obedience to one's elders. Exactly. But revolutionaries in Egypt generally tried to organise along horizontal lines. They tried to allow space for autonomous movements and voices within the revolutionary struggle. When the Muslim Brotherhood came into power, along with the presidency of Mohamed Morsi, they said to him, you are going to face a fight inside the institutions of the state, work with us to expand the democratic elements of the state and to beat back the non-democratic kind of layers of the deep state. And Morsi, I believe, completely rejected them and betrayed them. Morsi was also a great friend to global capital. The Muslim Brotherhood economically has gone through many different ideologies. Again, in its modern incarnation, its leaders have very strong links to private capital in the Gulf. They truly believed in Egypt's neoliberal projects. They tried to rehabilitate some of the corrupt tycoons and the crony capitalists who had done so well out of Mubarak's era. And so, understandably, revolutionaries, and not just self-described, sort of scarf-swaddled Molotov cocktail-holding revolutionaries on the streets of Egypt's cities, but the communities that I describe in the book who are just fighting for the basics of, drinking
instinctive
water.
revolutionaries.
Exactly, instinctive revolutionaries.
Not members of any
Precisely. Many of those individuals and communities voted for Mohamed Morsi in the presidential election and then joined the protest against him in early 2013. I remember Time magazine, the American news magazine, running a front cover which just said, Egypt, the world's best protesters, the world's worst Democrats. The implication being, of course, that to protest is somehow in opposition to the notion of being a Democrat. Whereas what Egyptians were actually saying, many of them, was, no, we're fighting for a deeper, more meaningful type of democracy.
But Jack, there was feelings on the other side, but no organization worth the name that could challenge them. There were many people who were there for very good reasons, would have gone further, but didn't know what to do. So you had in this political insurrection a strange situation when the obvious targets of such a mass movement are the television stations, the radio stations. The Tahrir was not far from the headquarters of Egyptian television.
Yeah.
They didn't go there. The Brotherhood wouldn't take them there, but no one else did either. That was one thing I noted at the time. And the second thing, given what the United States had done to that country, since Nasser's death, the role they had played, through their institutions and directly, the fact that Hillary Clinton was trying to cling on to Mubarak right till the end, saying, why, he's a family friend, which was certainly the case. Blair and company doing the same thing from behind the scenes here. I don't think I can recall a single anti-American slogan in Tahrir Square at all. And I thought, they are not going to get too far unless they take these issues up in a sort of, popular way, but they need to be taken up.
Exactly that. Our biggest failure on February 11th, 2011, when, the whole of the city was convulsed in joy and in celebration at Mubarak's fall, the failure to march on Maspero and take it there and then was a critical one. As you know, the revolution did not present itself as offering an alternative figurehead or a certain hierarchy of power to the state. Like many social movements and insurrectionary movements across the world in recent years, the model of political change in Egypt, which has been essentially very rhizomatic, it's based around lots of different routes and lots of different nodes of activity, without having a clear leader, without having a clear list of demands. The idea among many kind of hardcore revolutionaries is we need to get ourselves into a mental space where we can imagine a different kind of power and a different kind of sovereignty. That has proved sensationally effective not just in Egypt, at electrifying elites into crisis, and it's proved sensationally ineffective at sweeping those elites aside altogether and actually implementing a different kind of power. And unfortunately, the Muslim Brotherhood was the only political organisation that effectively was allowed to organise. Too. Oh, absolutely, they had suffered. But come 2011, you don't have a ready-made kind of revolutionary organisation on the ground. You have a set of Egyptian revolutionaries who are trying to find a way to somehow bring down the state. And essentially, the actual number of people involved in the streets is still a relatively small proportion of the wider population. Now, the revolutionaries failed to offer a coherent alternative to the mass population of Egypt. And in the first instance, the mass population put its faith to some degree in the Muslim Brotherhood when it came to the elections in 2012.
Also had illusions in the army.
Absolutely, and this was the key point. By 2013, when Mohamed Morsi is being overthrown, and in a coup, you know, where the generals are taking advantage of this turmoil on the ground, and you essentially have Egyptians saying, well, the other alternative is the army, which is also this coherent organisation. Everybody has a father or a brother or an uncle who is serving, yes. And like many post-colonial countries, there's this long heritage of anti-feudal, anti-imperialist resistance, mythology sort of woven into the army. And revolutionaries failed to offer a coherent and viable alternative other than continuing unrest in the streets.
But in those first few days after
Yes.
Mubarak's fall, I think the euphoria in the whole country was at fever pitch, that had the troops been told to open fire on the demonstrators, yes. You probably would have had mutinies.
Yes, absolutely. Well, in fact, there are junior officers and even mid-ranking officers who have basically said as much, that they were not willing to fire on Egypt's crowd. And of course, the fact that the Egyptian army, unlike in Syria, for example, didn't, initially at least, open fire on Egyptian crowds during those original 18 days.
That did for Mubarak, basically.
Yes, absolutely. But it also became something that the army instrumentalized later on, justifying its own counter-revolutionary policies. And of course, later on, the army on many different occasions has attacked Egyptian civilians.
There are limits to this type of struggle. Mm-hmm. Because if you take the example, I mean, the press and the media was concentrating on Tahrir, but the struggles were taking place all over the country. Mm-hmm. In Alexandria, I remember very well, for 3 days, there were no security forces of any sort in that city. Now, in a situation like this, the obvious response is dual power, to create organs of dual power with mass meetings to elect a city leadership on a very broad basis and saying, we don't want the security people in, we're going to run the city. But that wasn't done once again because the Brotherhood was strong and alternative forces were weak.
There were some forms of Lagan Shabeya, basically popular committees, which evolved within the revolutionary context, both providing security within different neighbourhoods, but also things like gas distribution and food distribution and ensuring kind of water supply. But you're absolutely right that those weren't built upon to create a cohesive alternative power structure that could actually challenge that of the state.
That's what... I mean, the mood was revolutionary, the insurrection was very clear, but politics and political strategy was very weak on the side of the revolutionaries.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's something which revolutionaries are aware of today, and they're fully aware that the next opportunity that comes, and the next opportunity will come, there will be further waves of unrest. There is going to have to be a different model of organisation and a different narrative and a different way of reaching out and knitting together that revolutionary sentiment into something that's more durable.
Is in your epilogue, you have this amazing description of arriving at Sharm el-Sheikh in mid-March 2015. And what is taking place is a big conference on Egypt, the future. Just describe that a bit.
So, this took place in March 2015, and it was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. I think they regret inviting me along, to be honest.
I'm sure they will. Yeah.
So it was organised by President Sisi with the help of the Gulf monarchs, who of course sponsor him both politically and economically, but arranged, as I describe in the book, by this interconnected grid of Western PR agencies, advertising companies, branding experts, many of whom employ the very political leaders in the West that have long given support to autocracy in the Middle East.
Tony Blair, Peter Mandelson.
Absolutely. And at this conference, not only were people like Tony Blair sort of keynote speakers, but you also had, I think it was 18 different heads of state, all there to kind of fawn over Sisi and to hold him up as Egypt's bright new future. The security security was ramped up, to the nth degree. You had helicopter gunships circling, you had special forces lining all the streets, and of course you had posters everywhere put up not just by the Egyptian government but by multinational corporations who were falling all over themselves to associate themselves, just like BP, whose chief executive, Bob Dudley, was a keynote speaker at the event. The most bizarre thing was that people were talking as if what Sisi was promising, which was, as we've already discussed, an expansion of neoliberal orthodoxy, new laws to protect foreign investors from any kind of democratic oversight, to shield them from possible court decisions reversing privatizations, essentially a bankruptcy law which would transfer all of the risk of foreign private investors essentially to Egyptian taxpayers. All of these different policies as part of this kind of GDP growth orientated fusion of military generals with transnational capital. It was being presented as this great new idea, and you had Christine Lagarde from the IMF and you had the head of the World Bank saying, no one's thought of this before, what a great combination. And I kept, having my hand up at the back saying, sorry, didn't we try this for 30 years and didn't it end in a massive revolution?
And isn't it being tried all over the world and ending in one disaster story after
Precisely.
the other?
What's interesting right now as we speak is that although the West is still backing Sisi to the hilt, and only last October David Cameron invited President Sisi to Downing Street and rolled out the red carpet. This is the same Prime Minister that in 2011 traipsed through Tahrir Square praising the young leaders of the pro-democracy movement. I mean, those young leaders are now behind bars, and meanwhile Sisi is shaking hands with David Cameron outside the doors of Number 10. But essentially, although that political support is still there from the West, and although the arms sales and the economic investment continues, there is a bit of a shift in the narrative now. You may well have heard that a young Italian PhD student was horribly murdered in Cairo last month. That has sent shockwaves through the international community. The European Parliament has passed a motion condemning that murder and saying that it's not just an isolated incident. Entirely hypocritically, of course.
A European life matters.
Absolutely, absolutely. And whereas there were more than 400 forcible disappearances last year in Egypt of Egyptians, almost 500 Egyptians killed in police custody, which didn't prompt any kind of European Parliament resolution. Nonetheless, this has cast a withering light onto the murky underside of the security state in Egypt. And Internazionale, the Italian news magazine, just last week had a front cover which consisted just of Sisi's face and the headline, "Egypt, the ferocious dictatorship of a mediocre leader." So you do get the sense that the gloss is just beginning to wear off Sisi. But of course, the West doesn't want to let him go and can't afford to let him go.
Jack, you're very optimistic, and so you should be. But after a defeat, it takes, I would say, a minimum of 2.5 decades for people to recover. But recover they will. And you're sure about that, are you?
There is no doubt that the counter-revolution is hugely in the ascendancy. The dictatorship in Egypt is becoming more wild, more unpredictable, and more brutal as a consequence. But I think we mustn't miss the wood for the trees. We're at the start of a process in which millions upon millions of not just Egyptian citizens, but citizens right across the Arab world are rejecting political exclusion, are rejecting economic exclusion, and they're rejecting the state violence that goes hands in hand with both. That model of state power is in its death throes, and there will be moments within that where we see the old guard on top, and other moments where we see those with a different idea of what power and sovereignty and economic justice can look like. We'll see them in the ascendancy. The pendulum will keep on swinging. And there will be a lot of pain still to come, and a lot of tragedy and a lot of bloodshed still to come, I'm sure. But already, as we sit here speaking, there are huge protests in Egypt over incidences of police torture. There are workers' strikes going up and down the country. The sense of the state and the president himself, Sisi, being inviolable and beyond any kind of mockery or criticism, is rapidly crumbling. This is a revolution that blew through the family dining room and the college lecture hall and the school playground just as forcibly as it did the corridors of government, and that's what gives me reasons for optimism. And I agree, it may take decades. I refer in the book to the 1840s, where you had another historical process in which, in that case, relatively the middle classes were trying to break, the power of the church and the noblemen and the aristocracy, and say, we have a right to be on the political stage as well. If you were sitting there in Europe in the early 1850s, you've said, well, these uprisings were clearly a failure. But I think they set in motion a period of historical transition which completely transformed the nature of the modern European state. And I think something similar is happening now in Egypt.
Jack, thanks very much. Good to talk.
Thank you very much for having me.